In the dark alleys of 19th-century Edinburgh, two men forged a deadly alliance that would send shockwaves through the city and resonate through history. Burke and Hare, seemingly ordinary men on the surface, were bound by an insatiable greed and a willingness to tread the darkest paths in pursuit of wealth. Body snatchers have been around since the beginning of time. Bodies for science, medicine, or even ghost brides have always been in demand, and these body snatchers, or resurrectionists as some call them, have one motto: the fresher, the better. This extremely profitable business would encourage people to do whatever it takes, like committing serial murder, to meet the demands of buyers, who are willing to pay up to $10,000 a body. 17th century England didn't really have any laws or a code of ethics when it came to medicine. You could source your cadavers from anywhere, but the most common practice was using the bodies of criminals. After trials, judges would pass sentences recommending anatomical dissection after execution to those who were found guilty, which was a lot, as anyone convicted of a capital crime was immediately sentenced to death. And capital crime wasn't limited to murder and treason like it is today. Back then, over 200 different offenses were classified as a capital crime, resulting in one of the largest numbers of executions in human history, making this era known as the Bloody Code. But these high numbers of executions meant there was a steady stream of bodies for science and medicine to use. On March 22, 1752, the Murder Act would be passed, which would go unchallenged for over 80 years. This led to more people being executed in hopes to deter crime. It also decreased the time between sentencing and execution. Most criminals convicted of a capital offense were only on death row for 2 days before they were executed. This act was designed to humiliate criminals and their families, so after death the anatomical dissections were required to be done publicly, and people from all over town would gather just to watch someone be cut open after they were executed. And it was during this time that Burke and Hare, a match made in absolute hell, grew up. They actually had a lot in common, as they were both from the province of Ulster in Northern Ireland. William Burke was born in 1792 and he was a laborer. He had a wife and 2 kids, but he dreamed of greener pastures, and those pastures did not include his family. So he would abandon them in Ireland and move to Scotland to start working on the Union Canal, and soon after moving to Scotland he ended up getting himself a mistress named Helen, and they ended up moving in together, which is how he ended up meeting William Hare. Hare was born sometime between 1792 and 1804, the exact date isn't clear, but when he was arrested after committing the murders, he claimed to be 21. Hare lived with Margaret. She was a widower, and so they weren't actually married, but they told people that they were. And together they owned and rented out a lodge, and coincidentally they lived on the same street as Burke and Helen, and being that they lived so close and had so many mutual interests, Burke and Hare soon became really good friends. Then in 1823, the Judgment of Death Act was passed, overturning the Bloody Code. This new act gave judges personal discretion on whether or not they used the death penalty, except for in cases of treason and murder, therefore reducing the amount of crimes punishable by death from 200 to 2, causing a significant decrease in the number of executions. Which is great for the criminals, but not so great for the scientific community, as they now had a body scarcity. This led to people turning to grave robbing to make some fast cash to meet the demands of buyers in the medical field. The problem became so bad that family members of the deceased would stand guard at their loved one's grave, until they were in later stages of decomposition, to deter anyone from robbing the grave, because the fresher the body, the more money someone got paid. They even built giant gray towers that are still standing today, that families could camp out in to overlook the cemetery. And Burke and Hare were introduced to this resurrectionist lifestyle by accident. On December of 1827, old Donald, who was a tenant at Hare's lodge, would suddenly and unexpectedly pass away due to illness. But unfortunately for him, he still owed Hare £4 of rent, which is around £413, or $503, So to get the money that he was owed, he decided to sell Donald's body behind his family's back. He enlisted the help of Burke and they hid the body during the funeral service, and weighed his coffin down with wood, so no one would know Donald wasn't inside. After the service, they found a very popular anatomy professor named Robert Knox. Robert worked at the University of Edinburgh. He didn't ask too many questions and he paid really well, giving the pair the perfect way to make money and go unnoticed. Robert paid the pair £7.10, almost double what Hare was due in rent. So the pair, thinking this is such easy money and a quick way to get rich, decided that it would be a good idea to find more bodies to sell. And they were so lucky that Joseph, another tenant at Hare's lodge, became suddenly ill. All they had to do was wait for him to take his last breath. But waiting for someone to die can take a long time, and really wear on somebody's patience, so instead of waiting to see if Joseph would die on his own, they decided to help him along. They gave him a large serving of whiskey, hoping to get him drunk, and once he was sufficiently incapacitated for them, they restrained him and then suffocated him by covering his mouth and nose with their hands. This became their favorite method of killing as it left no marks on the body, meaning they could get more money for it. But people who are so close to death's door are hard to come by. They got lucky 2 times, but most likely not a third, so they decided it would be best to make their own victims. They created a ruse. They would go to the poorest parts of Edinburgh and target people who they thought nobody would miss. Then Burke or Hare would walk up to them and befriend them, hoping to lull them into a false sense of comfort before inviting them over to the lodge for their untimely death. In the early days of their ruse, one of their victims, Janet Brown, who was a prostitute, would end up escaping. She was asked to go to the lodge by Burke, and in the middle of dinner excused herself for a short amount of time, which probably ended up saving her life. She only realized something was wrong because she came to the lodge with her friend Mary, also a prostitute, and when she got back to their room, Mary was gone. Hare gave her the excuse that while she was out, Mary and Burke had left together and she had just missed them, and instead of staying, she left the lodge. Little did she know, her friend Mary was dead in the next room, ready to be taken to Robert, and had she stayed she probably would have been right next to her. But even when Mary never shows up again and a missing report is filed, police don't look into the case, allowing Burke and Hare to use this ruse many times to get their next payday. But they became increasingly impatient, as they were tired of spending all this time befriending their victims just to kill them, so they began targeting anyone they could get their hands on. One of their targets was an elderly grandmother who they forced to overdose on painkillers, and after she was dead, Hare took her young blind grandson and broke his back over his knee. At this point, no one in the community was safe, and the medical students started asking questions because they could recognize some of their cadavers as the local prostitutes, one of which being Mary. After the medical students started becoming suspicious, a lot of rumors started to circulate due to the fact that the number of missing persons has spiked, and all of a sudden out of the blue the medical school has a lot of new cadavers. At this point the town is thinking something's not adding up, and people wonder if Robert Knox knows something nefarious is going on, because even his own students are picking up on a lot of weird things. Robert of course denied knowing any of the identities of the bodies sold to him by Burke and Hare, though a lot of people think he was lying because of all the new specimens in his lab. But common sense aside, the main reason people in the town thought Robert knew something about what Burke and Hare were up to was because of a disabled boy in the town who ended up going missing. The boy's body was never found, but all of a sudden at the anatomy lab, they had a disabled boy sold to them. But instead of reporting this suspicious activity to the police, Robert instead begins his dissection by removing the head and the deformed leg of the boy, allegedly to conceal his identity as the missing child. But even with all of the rumors circulating around town, Burke and Hare let their greed get the best of them and they became careless. The partnership between them started to break down due to Burke suspecting Hare was cutting him and his mistress Helen out of deals with Knox. This rift between the pair would be what ultimately led to their downfall. After their fight, Burke and Helen decided to start breaking away from Hare and go into business for themselves. They began trying to trap their own lodgers and would only occasionally work with Hare, and since they had gotten away with so many murders up into this point, they were really cocky. On Halloween of 1828, less than a year since they started doing their murder for cash business, things finally came to a close when they invited a woman named Marjorie to stay with them for the night. They told their other guests Ann and James to stay at another inn just for that one night, and they could come back the next day to get their stuff. However, the following day when Ann and James came back to collect their things, they were not allowed into the room where their things were being kept, and when they asked Burke and Hare where the other lodger Marjorie was, they said that she was asked to leave earlier in the night because she was flirting with Burke and was very out of line. But their story didn't make any sense, and on top of that everyone at the lodge was acting very suspicious, so Ann and James decided to wait, and the second they were left alone, they decided to search the room Burke and Hare were guarding. This is when they stumble across Marjorie's body underneath the bed. They confronted Helen with their discovery, and Helen tried to shut them up by offering to pay them £10 a week to keep quiet, but the pair couldn't be bought and went straight to the authorities. But when the cops got there, Marjorie's body was gone, but given the rumors about the spike in missing persons, and the eyewitness testimony from Ann and James, police arrested Burke, Hare, Helen, and Margaret all for the murder of Marjorie. While in custody, everybody was giving conflicting stories, and Burke and Hare were pointing fingers at each other. Eventually, the investigation into Marjorie led to Robert Knox's lab, where they were able to identify Marjorie as a new cadaver that had recently been sold to him. But even with all of this evidence and eyewitness testimony, police still said they didn't have enough evidence to prove that a crime was committed. Instead, they decided they needed to get the two men to turn on each other and get one of them to testify against the other. They decided to go to Hare and ask him to testify against Burke and Helen for full immunity, which he jumped at the opportunity for. Burke and Helen's trial began Christmas Eve of 1828. They were both charged with 3 murders, but Helen was eventually let go because under Scottish law at the time there wasn't enough evidence to prove that she was guilty of being an accomplice. Burke was obviously sentenced to death, and he was hung in front of a cheering crowd of over 25,000 people. And ironically, after his body was put on display in the middle of town after his execution, his body was donated to science. The med students were so intrigued by what he had done, they cut pieces of his flesh off to use as souvenirs to make card holders and book binders. Today, Burke's skeleton is still on display in Edinburgh at the Surgeon's Home Museum, right next to his death face. Robert Knox was also cleared of any wrongdoing despite the public's rage. His scandal ruined his reputation, and he was essentially kicked out of Edinburgh and had to move to London to try and salvage his career and reputation. He published several books until he ended up dying in 1862. Margaret and Helen also fled Scotland, and they were never really heard from again. No one really knows what ended up becoming of them. And Hare, of course, got off completely scot-free and also left Scotland to move to England. No one knows what ended up happening to him, but it is rumored that he was ambushed by an angry mob, thrown into a lime pit, then lived out the rest of his days as a blind beggar on the street. And his life mask is in the same museum right next to Burke. This match made in hell couldn't separate from each other, even in death. They are known to have officially killed 16 people, but it is suspected that they killed much more. The horrific nature of this case led to the passing of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which allowed doctors and members of the scientific community greater access to cadavers through legal donation of bodies, thus officially putting an end to the era of body snatching.